Hey, what's up YouTube? Today I have an iPhone 6 charge port. This will fix your charge port, your microphone, and your auxiliary jack. So let's jump right into it. Standard pentalobe screws, just like all the other iPhones. And what you're going to want to do is remove the entire screen when you do this. Some people want to get away with leaving the screen on. What can happen is if you drop that screen, you may damage that in the process. So very first thing, disconnecting the battery. We're going to need to get under this plate to change the charge port anyway, but always a great idea to unplug the battery very first before disconnecting any other connectors as well. So first, removing the plate that secures the LCD and the digitizer connections as well. This is the beginning of the process to replace the display or anything else related to the display as well. So, pointing to all the various screws associated with this, I'm removing the vibrator motor just below to give me a little bit more room. And then let's go ahead and start removing the loudspeaker. So if you do have a problem with your loudspeaker, this is the actual part for it. Although, on the bottom of the loudspeaker, there's some gold prongs that touch the connector on the charge port. And more often than not, that's what it's associated with. So it could be either of those problems if you're having loudspeaker issues. And like I mentioned before, this entire part houses the charge port, the microphone, the auxiliary port, and your connectors that the loudspeaker touches. So if you're having any one of those issues, most likely it is the charge port, or at least the part for the charge port. So we just removed the loudspeaker. Now we're just going to go through removing these screws. They are different sizes, so make sure you keep them all in the proper place. Sometimes a longer screw may not fit. Sometimes a longer screw might screw through the motherboard. Now on this particular repair, the motherboard is not underneath, but that is a possibility of damaging other things by putting the wrong screw in the wrong place. And as you saw on that top portion, I removed that bracket, so just make sure you set that aside of where it goes. Now, here in 1 second, I'm going to remove the entire piece. Now, you can heat it up to remove it. I just tear it right off because I'm replacing it anyway. There are two things you'll need to secure that microphone in place. There's two little brackets. So set those aside, taking note of how they go in. I'll zoom in on it here in a second so you can see where they go. But that little piece just ensures that the microphone is being pressed up against the housing so you get better quality. Right now I'm removing one of the brackets. It's a little black bracket that sits in between the metal frame and the new charge port. So I'm just making sure to scrape that off, put it back in the housing. Sometimes it comes off, sometimes it does not. All right, now I'm just making sure to put all my connectors back in, make sure that the auxiliary jack goes into the proper placement, that the microphone does, that your lightning port, any one of those things could be misaligned. The only time I've ever had an issue is with that speaker. If those gold prongs are not touching the gold prongs on the charge port connector, then your loudspeaker won't work. So if you put all this back together and everything works but your loudspeaker, double check that it's in the right spot, that those gold prongs are touching the right area. And just as a side note, this part cost me about $10 on Amazon. You get varying quality of parts. I could tell this one was maybe a refurbished part. I tested it afterwards and everything works perfectly. But for only $10, this could not be a more simple repair, or it's definitely not worth paying $800 for a new phone when most of the time it's just this connector. So if your phone just turns off, it could be one of two things or several things. One of the most common is a bad battery. The next, if you're noticing it's not charging whatsoever, try a charge port. For $10, it's worth trying for sure. So now I'm just connecting everything back. Now you'll notice that antenna wire, it goes off of the charge port connector under the loudspeaker connector, and then just make sure it's visible so you can reseat it on top of the logic board. Now we're just screwing everything back where it goes. I wouldn't say this repair is too complicated. I would say if you do lose track of your screws, that's where it is going to complicate the process. But luckily you do not have to remove the motherboard like you do on some of these repairs. So that's it. We put it back together. You've successfully replaced that part, and now you can test it and turn it back on.